The rain wouldn't stop falling that cold November morning. Tom Wilson stood by the freshly dug grave, watching water pool on the dark soil. His two kids, Lucy and Ben, held onto his hands so tight it almost hurt. But nothing could hurt more than what had already happened. 3 months ago, his wife Anna had been making breakfast like any other Tuesday. She was laughing at something their 8-year-old daughter had said when she suddenly grabbed her chest. The heart attack came without warning. No history of heart problems, no signs. One moment she was there, the next moment she wasn't. Tom was 42 years old and had never imagined being alone with 2 young children. Anna had been everything to their small family. She handled the farm's paperwork, talked to the bank when money got tight, and somehow made their small income stretch to cover everything they needed. She could calm a scared animal and balance their checkbook with the same gentle touch. Now, Tom stood in their farmhouse kitchen every morning, staring at bills he didn't understand. The medical costs from Anna's emergency hospital stay had reached $180,000. Their insurance had covered some of it, but not nearly enough. The remaining debt felt like a mountain he could never climb. Their farm in Montana had been struggling even before Anna died. 2 years of drought had destroyed their crops. The cattle they'd raised for beef had to be sold months ago just to buy groceries. What used to be green fields stretching to the horizon now looked like a dusty wasteland. The worst part wasn't even the money. It was watching his children try to understand why their mother wasn't coming home. 6-year-old Ben kept asking when Mommy would be back from heaven. Lucy, who was older, had stopped talking much at all. She just sat by her bedroom window, looking out at the empty fields. Tom tried to keep up with the farm work, but everything seemed to break at once. The old tractor needed repairs they couldn't afford. The barn roof leaked every time it rained. The house's heating system had started making strange noises that probably meant expensive problems ahead. At night, when the kids were finally asleep, Tom would sit at the kitchen table with a calculator and a pile of bills. No matter how many times he added the numbers, they never worked out. The bank wanted $320,000 in back payments. The mortgage hadn't been paid in 4 months. Property taxes were overdue. He'd started applying for jobs in town, driving 45 miles each way just to get turned down. His only work experience was farming, and nobody needed farmers anymore. The few jobs he could find paid minimum wage, which wouldn't even cover the gas money to drive there every day. Some nights, Tom would walk out to the old oak tree, where he and Anna used to sit and watch the sunset. He'd tell her about his day, about how scared he was, about how he didn't know what to do next. The tree felt like the only place where she might still be listening. The final blow came on a Tuesday morning in March. Tom was pouring cereal for breakfast when he saw the official envelope under the door. The bank's lawyer had sent the final notice, 60 days. That's all the time he had left to come up with the money or lose everything. As he read the letter, Lucy asked why they were eating cereal for dinner again. Tom realized he'd been feeding his children the same cheap meal for 3 days straight. Ben wanted to know if they could visit the grocery store and buy the cookies Mommy used to get. Tom had to explain that they needed to save money for important things. That night, Tom made the hardest phone call of his life. Anna's sister lived in Denver and had offered to help with the children if things got really bad. He'd always been too proud to ask for help, but pride wasn't going to keep his kids fed or housed. I might need you to take Lucy and Ben for a while, he told his sister-in-law. His voice cracked as he said the words. Just until I can figure out what comes next. She agreed immediately, but Tom could hear the worry in her voice. Everyone knew how much Anna had meant to him, how lost he'd been since she died. The thought of being separated from his children felt like losing the last pieces of the life he'd built with Anna, but keeping them with him while he lost the farm, while they had to move into some tiny apartment or worse, seemed even crueler. At least with their aunt, they'd have a stable home, good food, and a chance at a normal life. Tom spent the next few days making lists of everything he could sell. The farm equipment, even though most of it was old and broken. Anna's jewelry, including her wedding ring, though the thought of selling it made him sick. Even the family photos and furniture might bring in a few dollars. Every morning, he'd wake up hoping this was all just a terrible dream. But the empty bed beside him and the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter reminded him that his nightmare was real. The farm that had been in his family for 3 generations was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The envelope looked different from all the others. This one was thicker, with official stamps and the kind of paper that meant serious business. Tom's hands shook as he opened it at the kitchen table where he'd opened so many bad news letters before. Final notice of foreclosure proceedings was printed in bold letters across the top. 60 days. That's all the time he had left to save his family's farm. The number at the bottom made his stomach drop. $320,000. It might as well have been $3 million. Tom read the letter 3 times, hoping he'd missed something, hoping there was some mistake. But the math was brutal and clear. Missed mortgage payments, accumulated interest, legal fees, and penalties had created a debt so large it felt impossible to even imagine paying it back. He looked around the kitchen where Anna used to make coffee every morning. The cabinets needed painting, the floor had water stains from the leaky roof, and the old refrigerator made noises like it might die any day. Even if he could somehow keep the farm, everything needed expensive repairs he couldn't afford. The kids were getting ready for school, arguing about whose turn it was to use the bathroom. Tom tried to act normal, making their lunch with the last bits of bread and peanut butter. Lucy had been asking for the name-brand snacks her friends brought to school, but generic crackers were all he could manage. "Dad, can we have pancakes this weekend?" Ben asked, tugging on Tom's shirt. "Like Mom used to make?" Tom's throat tightened. Anna always made pancakes on Saturday mornings, complete with whipped cream and fresh berries. Now Tom was lucky if he could afford syrup for the cheap frozen waffles he'd been buying. "We'll see, buddy," Tom said, which had become his standard answer for everything Ben wanted. It was easier than explaining why they couldn't have the things that used to be normal parts of their life after the kids left for school. Tom drove to town to look for work again. He'd already been turned down at the hardware store, the gas station, and both restaurants. Today he tried the auto repair shop and the small grocery store. Same answer everywhere: they weren't hiring, and if they were, they needed someone with experience in their specific business. The job center had 3 openings posted. One was for a computer programmer, which might as well have been rocket scientist as far as Tom was concerned. The other 2 were minimum wage jobs that would require him to drive over an hour each way. After paying for gas and childcare, he'd actually lose money working those jobs. On the drive home, Tom's truck started making a new noise. The engine sputtered twice before smoothing out again. Even his truck was falling apart. If it died completely, he'd have no way to look for work or take the kids to school that afternoon. He started making a list of everything he could sell. The old tractor in the barn might bring in $5,000 if he was lucky. The farming equipment was mostly junk, but scrap metal dealers might pay something for it. Anna's jewelry box sat on the dresser where she'd left it, and Tom couldn't bring himself to even open it yet. The house itself was worth something, but with the mortgage debt, selling it wouldn't leave him with any money. And where would he and the kids live then? Apartments in town cost more per month than the farm mortgage had been. Evening came too quickly, bringing the kids home with homework and questions about dinner. Tom heated up canned soup again, the 3rd time that week. Lucy gave him a look that seemed way too old for an 8-year-old. "Are we poor now?" she asked quietly while Ben was distracted with his coloring book. Tom wanted to lie, to tell her everything was fine. But Lucy was smart and had been watching him struggle for months. She deserved some version of the truth. "We're going through a tough time," he said carefully. "But we're going to figure it out." "Is that why you've been sad all the time?" The question hit him like a punch. He'd been trying so hard to hide his depression from the kids, but apparently he hadn't done a very good job. Children saw everything, even when adults thought they were being careful. That night, after putting the kids to bed, Tom called Anna's sister in Denver. The conversation he'd been dreading for weeks couldn't be avoided any longer. "I need to ask for that help you offered," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," she replied immediately. "What do you need?" kids," Tom said, and the words felt like swallowing glass. "I might need you to take Lucy and Ben for a while. Just until I can get back on my feet." The silence on the other end of the phone lasted forever. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "Tom, you know we love those kids like our own. They can stay as long as needed, but what about you? Where will you go?" Tom didn't have an answer. He'd been so focused on making sure Lucy and Ben were safe that he hadn't thought about his own future. Maybe he'd live in the truck for a while, or find a cheap room somewhere. Maybe he'd become one of those men who worked odd jobs and sent money to their kids when they could. "I'll figure something out," he said, though he had no idea what that something might be. After hanging up, Tom sat in the dark kitchen and let himself cry for the first time since Anna's funeral. He was 42 years old, about to lose everything his family had built and preparing to send his children away. If there was a bottom to hit, he was pretty sure he'd found it. 30 days left. The number haunted Tom every morning when he woke up and every night when he tried to sleep. 30 days until the bank came to take away everything his grandfather had built, everything his father had worked to maintain, everything he'd hoped to pass down to Lucy and Ben. The phone call to Anna's sister had been made, and she was driving up from Denver next weekend to pick up the kids. Tom had explained it to them as a fun vacation with their aunt, but Lucy's suspicious looks told him she wasn't buying the story. Ben seemed excited about the adventure, which somehow made Tom feel even worse. With the children's immediate future secured, Tom faced the brutal task of turning his family's entire life into cash. He started in the barn, cataloging every piece of equipment, every tool, every scrap of metal that might have value. Most of it was older than he was, passed down through generations of Wilson farmers. His grandfather's tractor sat in the corner, covered with dust and bird droppings. Tom remembered riding on that tractor as a 5-year-old, feeling like the king of the world as they plowed the fields together. Now it was just another item on his auction list, maybe worth $5,000 if someone needed parts. The smaller tools might bring in a few $100s each. Old hammers, wrenches, and farming implements that had built this place were now reduced to price tags in Tom's notebook. Each item felt like he was selling off pieces of his own history, and his jewelry was the hardest decision. Tom sat on their bed, holding the small wooden box she'd kept on the dresser. Inside were her wedding ring, a necklace her grandmother had given her, and a few other pieces they'd bought during happier times. The wedding ring alone might be worth $2,000, but the thought of selling it felt like betraying everything they'd shared. He closed the box without making a decision. Some things could wait until he'd exhausted every other option. The house itself was full of furniture that might have value. The dining room table where they'd eaten thousands of meals together. The couch where they'd watched movies as a family. Ben's crib, which they'd saved hoping for more children someday. Everything had to go. Tom started moving the heavy equipment in the barn, trying to make space so potential buyers could see what was available. The old tractors and plows had been sitting in the same spots for years, and moving them required more strength than he'd used in months. As he pushed and pulled the machinery around, something didn't sound right. When he moved his grandfather's tractor away from the far wall, his footsteps sounded different on that section of the concrete floor. Instead of the solid thunk his boots usually made, there was a hollow echo, like he was walking on a wooden floor instead of concrete. Tom stopped and listened more carefully. He stamped his foot on the normal part of the floor, then moved to the area that sounded strange. The difference was clear once he paid attention to it. Something was definitely different about that section of flooring. Curious, despite his exhaustion, Tom grabbed a metal rod from his toolbox and tapped it against the floor in different spots. Most areas gave a solid, dull sound when he struck them, but a rectangular section about 4 feet by 6 feet rang out with a distinctly hollow note. His first thought was that there might be a septic tank or water line under that spot, though he didn't remember his father ever mentioning anything like that. The house had its own septic system on the other side of the property, and the well was near the front yard. Tom knelt down and examined the concrete more carefully. Now that he was looking for it, he could see that the hollow-sounding section had slightly different coloring than the rest of the floor. It was subtle, like someone had patched this area years ago and the new concrete had aged differently than the original dot. The smart thing to do was ignore it and focus on the auction preparation. He had enough real problems without going on some wild treasure hunt based on weird floor sounds. But something about the discovery nagged at him. In all his years working on this farm, his father had never mentioned anything unusual about the barn floor. Tom's neighbor Frank had a sledgehammer he could borrow. Frank was also the closest thing to family Tom had left in the area, since Anna's relatives all lived far away. If he was going to investigate this mystery, Frank was the logical person to ask for help. The walk to Frank's house gave Tom time to think about what he was doing. Was this just another way to avoid facing reality? Was he so desperate to save the farm that he was chasing fantasies about hidden treasure? It sounded crazy even to him, but what did he really have to lose at this point? If there was nothing under the floor, he'd wasted a few hours and maybe damaged some concrete he was about to lose anyway. If there was something, well, he couldn't imagine what it might be, but anything had to be better than his current situation. Frank was working in his garden when Tom walked up. They'd been neighbors for 15 years, and Frank had been one of the few people who really understood what Tom was going through. His own wife had died 5 years earlier, though from cancer rather than a sudden heart attack. "Need to borrow your sledgehammer," Tom said without explanation. Frank looked up from his tomato plants and studied Tom's face. "What are you planning to break?" "Maybe nothing. Maybe something important? I'm not really sure yet." It wasn't much of an explanation, but Frank had learned not to ask too many questions when people were dealing with grief. He fetched the sledgehammer from his garage and handed it over. "Just be careful," Frank said, "and call if you need help moving whatever you're trying to move." Walking back to his barn with the heavy tool, Tom felt like he was either about to discover something that could change everything or about to make his problems even worse. At this point in his life, those seemed like the only two options left. Tom stood in his barn holding Frank's sledgehammer, staring down at the section of floor that sounded different from the rest. The weight of the tool in his hands felt heavier than it should, like he was holding something that could either save his life or ruin it completely. He started with small, careful taps around the edges of the hollow-sounding area. The concrete was old but solid, and each strike sent vibrations up through his arms. After a few minutes of gentle testing, he realized that light taps weren't going to accomplish anything meaningful. Tom took a deep breath and swung the sledgehammer with real force. The impact sent chunks of concrete flying and left a crater about the size of his fist. The hollow sound was even more pronounced now, and he could see that the concrete in this section was much thinner than it should be. As he continued working, sweat dripping down his face despite the cool March air, Tom began to understand what he was looking at. Someone had definitely cut through the original floor and patched it back up. The repair job was good enough to last for decades, but not good enough to perfectly match the surrounding concrete. After an hour of steady work, Tom had broken through most of the concrete patch. Underneath was not dirt, as he'd expected, but empty space. Someone had dug a hole under the barn floor and then carefully concealed it. Tom used the sledgehammer's handle to probe the hole, and quickly discovered that it was much deeper than expected. The metal handle extended down at least 3 feet before hitting something solid. Whatever was down there, it was big enough to require serious excavation. He grabbed a flashlight from his toolbox and shined it down into the hole. The beam revealed rough dirt walls and what looked like wooden planks at the bottom. Someone had built an actual underground storage space beneath his barn, and they'd done it well enough that it had stayed hidden for probably decades. The thought crossed Tom's mind that this could be dangerous. People didn't usually hide things underground unless those things were either very valuable or very illegal. Old farms sometimes had hidden alcohol stashes from Prohibition days, but that was almost a century ago. This hiding spot looked more recent. Still, Tom had come too far to stop now. He widened the hole until it was large enough for him to climb down into, then lowered himself carefully into the underground chamber. The space was bigger than it had appeared from above, roughly the size of a small closet, His flashlight beam revealed two large metal cases sitting on the wooden floor. They looked like military surplus storage containers, the kind designed to protect important equipment from water and damage. Both cases were secured with heavy latches but no locks. Tom's heart was pounding as he opened the first case. Inside, wrapped in what looked like oiled cloth, were stacks of documents and photographs. The papers were yellowed with age but still readable. At the top of the first stack was a letterhead he recognized from old war movies. Official Nazi military correspondence. The documents were mostly in German, but Tom could make out dates from the 1940s and official stamps that looked authentic. There were also maps of the United States with various locations marked, including several spots in Montana. One photograph showed a group of men in military uniforms standing next to what looked like the exact barn where Tom was now crouching. The second case was much heavier. When Tom opened it, his flashlight beam reflected off dozens of small metallic objects. At first glance, they looked like coins or medallions, each about the size of a silver dollar. But as Tom picked one up, he realized it was much heavier than any coin should be. The medallions were made of metal that had a distinct golden color, even under the artificial light. Each one was engraved with symbols that Tom didn't recognize, along with Nazi emblems that he definitely did recognize. Some featured elaborate designs that looked like they belonged in a museum. Tom counted 47 medallions in total, each individually wrapped in cloth and carefully arranged in foam padding. Whatever these things were, someone had taken great care to preserve them. The craftsmanship was incredible, with details so fine they must have been made by master artisans. As he examined the medallions more closely, Tom noticed that many of them had inscriptions in what looked like several different languages. Some appeared to be Latin, others looked like they might be Hebrew or Arabic. The variety suggested these weren't standard Nazi military items, but rather things that had been collected from various sources. The historical documents were equally puzzling. Along with the German military papers, there were what appeared to be transfer records and inventories written in English. One document, dated 1944, mentioned Project Golden Eagle and included a list of cultural acquisitions being moved to secure American locations. Tom's hands were shaking as he photographed everything with his phone. He wasn't a historian, but even he could recognize that this discovery was far beyond anything he could handle alone. These weren't just old farming tools or family heirlooms, hidden away for safekeeping. This was something connected to World War II and potentially something that had been stolen during the war. The implications were staggering. If these medallions were actually made of gold, and if they were genuine historical artifacts, they could be worth enormous amounts of money. But they could also be evidence of war crimes or stolen property that belonged to museums or families who had been robbed by the Nazis. Tom carefully packed everything back into the cases exactly as he'd found it. Whatever this discovery meant, it was too important and too complicated for him to make decisions about alone. He needed expert help, and he needed it fast. As he climbed out of the hidden chamber, Tom's mind was racing with possibilities. 30 days ago, he'd been facing the loss of his farm and separation from his children. Now he was sitting on what might be one of the most significant World War II discoveries in decades, but Tom had learned not to count on good luck. There would be legal complications, authentication processes, and probably government involvement. The question wasn't whether this discovery could save his farm, but whether he'd be allowed to keep any of it at all. Tom spent the entire night staring at the photos on his phone, unable to sleep. The images of those golden medallions and Nazi documents seemed too incredible to be real. By morning, he'd convinced himself 3 different times that he'd imagined the whole thing, only to look at the photographic evidence again and realize it had actually happened. The kids were leaving for their aunt's house in 2 days, and Tom still had 28 days to save the farm. If this discovery was going to help him, he needed to move fast. But who could he trust with something this important and potentially valuable? Tom's first call was to the local library. The librarian, Mrs. Rodriguez, had always been helpful when the kids needed research assistance for school projects. She listened patiently as Tom explained he'd found some old documents that might be historically significant, without mentioning the medallions or the potential value. "You need to talk to someone at the State University," she said immediately. "They have a history department with people who specialize in World War II research. Dr. Elizabeth Chun is probably the person you want. She's written books about Nazi operations in America." Tom wrote down the contact information, his hands still shaking slightly from exhaustion and stress. He'd never called a university professor before, and he wasn't sure how to explain his situation without sounding like he was crazy or lying. Dr. Chun's office phone went to voicemail, but Tom left a message explaining that he was a local farmer who had discovered what appeared to be World War II documents and artifacts on his property. He tried to sound calm and rational, though he felt anything but calm. The return call came within 2 hours, which surprised Tom. Dr. Chun had a slight accent and spoke with the kind of precision that made him feel like every word mattered. "Mr. Wilson, you mentioned Nazi documents in your message. Can you be more specific about what you found?" Tom took a deep breath and decided to trust her with the basic facts. He described the hidden chamber, the military correspondence, and the photographs of uniformed men. He was careful not to mention the medallions over the phone, sensing that some things were too sensitive for phone conversations. "This is very unusual," Dr. Chun said after a long pause. "Would it be possible for me to examine these documents in person? If they're authentic, this could be a significant historical discovery." They arranged to meet the following afternoon at Tom's farm. Dr. Chun explained that she'd bring some basic authentication equipment and a colleague who specialized in document analysis. Tom spent the rest of the day cleaning up the barn and trying to figure out how much to reveal during their first meeting. Dr. Chun arrived with a younger man she introduced as Dr. Martinez, a specialist in wartime document forgeries. Both professors looked exactly like Tom had imagined university experts would look: serious, intelligent, and slightly overwhelmed by the rural farm setting. Tom led them to the barn and showed them the hidden chamber. Dr. Chun's reaction to seeing the excavation site was immediate and dramatic. She knelt beside the hole, examining the construction and taking numerous photographs. "This type of concealment is consistent with wartime hiding places," she said to her colleague. "The construction techniques match what we've seen at other sites where Nazi operatives hid materials." When Tom opened the first case and revealed the documents, both professors became very quiet. Dr. Chun handled the papers with surgical gloves, examining the letterheads, stamps, and paper quality with a magnifying glass. Dr. Martinez focused on photographing everything with high-resolution equipment. "These appear to be authentic," Dr. Chun said after 30 minutes of careful examination. "The paper is correct for the period, the stamps match known examples, and the German text contains period-appropriate terminology. But we'll need laboratory analysis to be certain." Tom's heart was pounding, but he knew the real test was still coming. He opened the second case and revealed the golden medallions. The reaction from both professors was immediate and intense. "My God," Dr. Martinez whispered. "These look like stolen cultural artifacts." Dr. Chun picked up one of the medallions with tweezers, examining it under a powerful magnifying glass. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary. This appears to be medieval. European goldwork, possibly from a museum or private collection?" She looked up at Tom with an expression that was part excitement and part concern. "Mr. Wilson, if these are what I think they are, you've discovered evidence of Nazi cultural theft on a massive scale. These medallions could be priceless historical artifacts that were stolen from Jewish families or European museums during the war." Tom felt his knees go weak. "What does that mean for me? Am I allowed to keep them?" Dr. Chun and Dr. Martinez exchanged glances. "The legal situation is complicated," Dr. Chun said carefully. "But in cases like this, when stolen artifacts are recovered decades later, the finder often has legal claim to them if the original owners can't be identified or if they've passed away without heirs." She continued examining the medallions while explaining the process. We'll need to contact federal authorities, probably the FBI's art crime team. They'll want to investigate the historical context and verify that these aren't currently listed as stolen property. But if everything checks out, you could potentially sell these through legitimate auction houses. Tom's mind was spinning. How long does that process take? Usually several months, Dr. Martinez replied. But given the potential value and historical significance, agencies tend to move relatively quickly on cases like this. Dr. Chun was still studying the medallions. Mr. Wilson, I need to ask you something very important. Do you have any financial pressures that might affect how you handle this discovery? I ask because the legal process requires patience, and sometimes people make poor decisions when they're desperate. Tom decided to be completely honest. He explained about Anna's death, the medical bills, the foreclosure notice, and his plan to send the children away. Both professors listened without interruption, their expressions growing more sympathetic as the story unfolded. 26 days, Tom finished. That's how long I have before the bank takes the farm. Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking through the implications. Mr. Wilson, based on what I'm seeing here, I believe these artifacts could be worth millions of dollars. But the authentication and legal process typically takes much longer than 26 days. She paused, then continued. However, there might be options. Some auction houses provide advances against proven historical artifacts, especially ones with clear legal provenance. If we can fast-track the authentication process and get federal clearance quickly, you might be able to secure emergency funding to save your farm. Tom felt like the barn was spinning around him, millions of dollars. The phrase seemed impossible to connect with his current reality of choosing between groceries and gasoline. What do we do first? He asked. Dr. Chun was already pulling out her phone. First, I call the FBI art crime team. Then we contact the most reputable auction houses in the country. If these artifacts are what I think they are, Mr. Wilson, your family's financial problems may be about to become a very distant memory. The next 3 weeks felt like the longest and shortest of Tom's entire life. Every day brought phone calls from federal agents, university researchers, auction house experts, and lawyers he'd never heard of. His quiet farm had become the center of what Dr. Chun called one of the most significant World War II discoveries in recent American history. The FBI art crime team had arrived within 48 hours of Dr. Chun's initial call. Agent Rodriguez, a woman in her 40s who specialized in Nazi-looted art, had spent 2 full days documenting everything in the hidden chamber. She'd explained that the federal investigation was routine for discoveries of this magnitude, but that Tom shouldn't worry about losing his claim to the artifacts. These items have been hidden on your property for probably 70 years, Agent Rodriguez had told him. As long as they're not currently listed as stolen property by international authorities, and as long as you cooperate fully with our investigation, you'll retain ownership rights under treasure trove laws. The authentication process had been fascinating and terrifying. Experts from 3 different universities had examined the medallions using techniques Tom had never heard of. They'd tested the gold content, analyzed the craftsmanship styles, and compared the engravings to historical databases of known artifacts. Dr. Chun had become Tom's unofficial guide through the process, calling him every few days with updates. The documents had been verified as authentic Nazi correspondence from something called NNERB, a Nazi organization that had stolen cultural artifacts throughout occupied Europe. The medallions were confirmed as genuine medieval and Renaissance pieces, stolen from Jewish families in European museums between 1941 and 1944. The Operation Golden Eagle documents are particularly significant, Dr. Chen had explained during one of their conversations. They prove that Nazi operatives were establishing hiding places throughout rural America, probably planning to retrieve these treasures after the war ended. Tom had learned more about World War II history in 3 weeks than he'd learned in his entire education. But the history lessons weren't what kept him awake at night. It was the uncertainty about whether this discovery would actually save his farm and how much longer the process would take. The foreclosure deadline was now just 5 days away. Tom had explained his situation to the bank president, showing him newspaper articles about the discovery and documentation from the FBI investigation. The bank had agreed to a 1-week extension, but they wanted concrete proof that Tom would be able to pay his debts. Before granting any longer delays, Tom was feeding the chickens behind the house when his phone rang on that Friday afternoon. Dr. Chin's name appeared on the screen, and something in her tone immediately told him this call was different from all the others. "Tom, I need you to sit down," she said, without any preliminary greeting. Tom's heart started pounding. "Is there a problem with the authentication?" "No problem at all. Actually, quite the opposite. The final valuation report just came in from the International Auction House Consortium." "Tom, are you sitting down?" "I'm standing in my chicken coop," Tom replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just tell me what you found out." Dr. Chun took a deep breath. "The 47 medallions have been authenticated as genuine historical artifacts from some of Europe's most important cultural collections. Several pieces are from the famous Rothschild collection, others are from museums in Prague and Vienna. The total estimated auction value is $43.2 million. Tom's legs gave out, and he sat down hard on an overturned bucket. The chickens scattered around him, clucking in annoyance. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that number?" $43.2 million. "Tom, you're looking at one of the most valuable discoveries of Nazi-looted art ever recovered in the United States." Tom couldn't speak. The number was so far beyond anything he'd imagined that his brain couldn't process it. $43 million. His farm's entire debt was less than 1% of that amount. "Tom, are you still there?" "I'm here," Tom managed to say. "I just can't be right, are you sure?" Dr. Chun's voice was gentle but excited. "I've triple-checked everything. The lead appraiser is Dr. Hoffman from Sotheby's, and he's considered the world's leading expert on medieval European goldwork. 3 separate auction houses have confirmed the valuation independently." Tom stood up and started pacing around the chicken coop, his mind spinning. "What happens now? How long before I can actually access any money?" "That's where I have more good news," Dr. Chun continued. "Because the federal investigation found no current theft claims against these specific pieces, and because the historical documentation proves they've been on your property since the 1940s, you have clear legal ownership. Sotheby's has offered to provide an immediate advance of $5 million against the eventual sale, which they expect to happen within 6 months. $5 million immediately." Tom had to sit down again. Yesterday he'd been figuring out how to tell Lucy and Ben that they might be living with their aunt permanently. Today he was being told he was about to become one of the wealthiest people in Montana. "Dr. Chun, I need to ask you something important," Tom said, his voice shaking. "Is this real? Am I really about to get $5 million, or is there some catch I don't understand yet?" "Tom, I've been studying Nazi-looted art for 20 years, and I've never seen a case with clearer legal standing or more solid authentication. The auction house wouldn't offer an advance if they weren't completely confident in the sale value. This is as real as it gets." Tom ended the call and sat in his chicken coop for almost an hour, watching his birds peck at their feed and trying to process what had just happened. Lucy and Ben were still at their aunt's house, scheduled to start school there next week because Tom had been unable to guarantee he could provide for them. Now he was about to become wealthy enough to provide for them for the rest of their lives. The irony wasn't lost on him. Anna had always said that something good would come from their struggles, that their family was meant for better things. She died believing they would somehow find a way through their problems. Even when Tom couldn't see any solutions, the hidden treasure had been under their feet for their entire marriage. While they'd struggled to pay bills and worry about the farm's future, $43 million worth of artifacts had been waiting just beneath the barn floor. Tom's phone rang again. This time it was Lucy calling from her aunt's house. "Daddy, when are we coming home?" she asked in the small voice she'd been using since Anna died. Tom smiled for the first time in months. "Very soon, sweetheart. We're all coming home very soon." The $5 million advance arrived in Tom's bank account on a Tuesday morning, 3 days before the foreclosure deadline. Tom had been checking his account balance obsessively every few hours, still not quite believing that such an enormous sum of money could actually belong to him. When the numbers finally appeared on his phone screen, Tom had to refresh the banking app 3 times to make sure he wasn't seeing things. The account that had shown a balance of negative $214 the day before now displayed $5 million. Tom's first call was to the bank president, Mr. Henderson, who had been surprisingly patient during the extension negotiations. Henderson's voice changed completely when Tom explained that he was ready to pay off the entire farm debt immediately. "Mr. Wilson, are you certain about this? The full amount, including penalties and legal fees, comes to $328,000. "I'm certain," Tom replied, still amazed by how easily he could say those words. "Can we arrange the payment this afternoon?" 2 hours later, Tom walked into the bank with a cashier's check that represented more money than his family had ever seen. The same bank that had been threatening to foreclose on his property was now treating him like their most valued customer. The loan officer who had delivered the foreclosure notice personally apologized for any stress the process had caused. Walking out of the bank as the full owner of his farm felt like stepping into someone else's life. Tom drove home and sat in his kitchen, looking around at the same peeling paint and water-stained ceiling he'd been staring at for months. The difference was that now he could fix everything and still have more money left over than he could spend in several lifetimes. His second call was to Anna's sister in Denver. "The kids can come home," he said simply. "Tom, that's wonderful news. Did you find a job?" Tom laughed, the first genuine laugh he'd had since Anna died. "You could say that. I'll explain everything when you get here, but Lucy and Ben can come home immediately. And they never have to worry about money again." The drive to pick up his children took 4 hours, but Tom didn't mind. He spent the time planning all the things he could finally give them: new clothes, healthy food, college educations, and most importantly, the security of knowing they'd never have to fear losing their home again. Lucy and Ben's reaction to seeing him was everything Tom had hoped for. They ran to him like he'd been gone for months instead of 3 weeks, and Ben immediately started chattering about everything he'd done with their aunt. Lucy was more reserved, but Tom could see the relief in her eyes when he told them they were going home to stay. "Are we still poor?" Lucy asked during the drive home, the same question that had broken Tom's heart weeks earlier. "No, sweetheart," Tom said, meeting her eyes in the rearview mirror. "We're not poor anymore. We're going to be just fine." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of decisions Tom had never imagined having to make. Financial advisors, investment managers, and lawyers all wanted meetings to help him handle his new wealth responsibly. Dr. Chun had recommended a firm that specialized in helping people who suddenly acquired large amounts of money, and Tom found their guidance invaluable. The first major decision was what to do with the farm itself. Tom could now afford to modernize everything, but he wanted to be smart about it. The financial advisors helped him understand that with proper investment, the $5 million advance could generate enough income to support his family comfortably, even without touching the remaining $38 million that would come from the auction. Tom decided to transform the farm into something Anna would have been proud of. He hired contractors to repair the house completely, installing new roofing, updated electrical systems, and modern appliances. But he was careful to preserve the character that made it feel like home. The barn where he'd made the discovery was expanded and converted into a proper equipment building with climate control. Tom bought new farming equipment, but he also kept his grandfather's old tractor, completely restored and displayed in a place of honor. The farm's operations got a complete overhaul as well. Tom hired agricultural consultants who helped him transition to sustainable farming practices that would be both environmentally responsible and profitable. Solar panels were installed to power the entire property, and a new irrigation system was designed to use water more efficiently, but the most important change was hiring help. Tom brought in 3 full-time workers, all local people who had been struggling to find good employment in the rural area. He paid them well above market wages and provided full health insurance. Remembering how devastating medical costs had been for his own family, Ben and Lucy, adjusted to their new circumstances with the resilience that had gotten them through their mother's death. Ben was excited about everything, especially the new playground equipment Tom had installed behind the house. Lucy was more cautious, but Tom could see her gradually accepting that their security was real and permanent. The first grocery shopping trip after the money arrived was emotional for Tom. For months, he'd been choosing between food and other necessities, calculating every purchase. Now he walked through the store buying everything Lucy and Ben wanted, plus healthy foods he hadn't been able to afford in years. "Can we really get whatever we want?" Ben asked, staring at the cookie aisle with wide eyes. "Within reason," Tom replied, putting 3 different types of cookies in their cart. "But we're also going to make sure we eat vegetables and healthy food, okay?" Tom was careful not to spoil his children, but he wanted them to feel secure in ways they hadn't since their mother died. New clothes, books, toys, and experiences were all things he could finally provide without worry. The farm started attracting attention from agricultural magazines and sustainability organizations. Tom's story of nearly losing everything and then discovering hidden treasure was compelling, but his transformation of the property into a model sustainable farm was equally impressive. Local news stations wanted interviews, and Tom agreed to a few, though he was careful to protect his children's privacy. The story of the Nazi treasure discovery was already public knowledge, but Tom wanted to control how much attention his family received. 6 months after the discovery, Tom's farm was completely transformed. What had been a struggling, debt-ridden property was now a showcase of modern, sustainable agriculture. The house was comfortable and beautiful. The barn was equipped with the latest technology, and the fields were producing crops again. Most importantly, Lucy and Ben were thriving. They had stability, security, and a father who wasn't constantly stressed about money. Tom could see Anna's influence in the way he made decisions about their new wealth, always considering what would be best for the children's long-term happiness rather than what would be most impressive or expensive. The discovery that had saved Tom's farm was generating positive changes throughout the local community as well. The jobs he'd created, the contractors he'd hired, and the equipment he'd purchased all contributed to the local economy. Tom was becoming known not just as the man who found Nazi treasure, but as someone who used his good fortune to help others. 2 years after the discovery that changed everything, Tom Wilson stood in his completely transformed farmhouse kitchen, watching Lucy help 10-year-old Ben with his homework. The morning light streamed through new windows that replaced the old, drafty ones that used to let in cold air and worry. The final auction of the Nazi artifacts had concluded 6 months earlier, bringing in even more money than the initial estimates. After taxes and fees, Tom's total proceeds came to $38 million. Combined with the original $5 million advance, his family was now wealthy beyond anything he could have imagined during those desperate months after Anna's death. But wealth, Tom had learned, was more complicated than simply having money in the bank. The real transformation had been figuring out how to use that money in ways that would honor Anna's memory and create positive change for his children and community. The farm had become something Anna would have been proud of. Tom now employed 12 local families, paying wages that allowed them to buy homes and support their children's educations. The sustainable farming operation had become profitable enough to support itself, meaning the jobs were secure long-term rather than dependent on Tom's personal wealth. The property itself had become a model that other farms studied and copied. Solar panels provided all the electricity needed for the house and farm operations. An advanced water recycling system meant the farm used 60% less water than traditional operations. The crops were all organic, and Tom had started a small farmers market operation that sold directly to families in the surrounding area. But the most meaningful change was the foundation Tom had established in Anna's name. The Anna Wilson Foundation provided financial assistance to families facing medical bankruptcies, the same crisis that had nearly destroyed Tom's family. The foundation had already helped 43 families avoid losing their homes due to medical debt. Lucy, now 10 years old, had developed a deep interest in helping run the foundation. She helped Tom read through applications from families asking for assistance, and her questions often helped him understand which cases were most urgent. Her compassion reminded Tom of Anna's gentle way of seeing the best in people. Ben had adapted to their new circumstances with enthusiasm that sometimes amazed Tom. The 8-year-old had become fascinated with the farm's sustainable technology, asking endless questions about how the solar panels worked and why certain crops grew better with organic methods. Tom suspected Ben might become an engineer or scientist someday. The discovery site itself had become a memorial of sorts. Tom had converted the barn area where he'd found the hidden chamber into a small museum space. Visitors could see replicas of some of the artifacts and learn about the Nazi looting operations that had brought stolen treasures to rural America. All proceeds from museum visits went to organizations that helped return stolen art to the families from whom it had been taken. Dr. Chun had remained involved in Tom's story, helping him understand the historical significance of his discovery and connecting him with other families whose stolen art had been recovered. 3 of the medallions Tom had found were eventually returned to families in Europe, who could prove their grandparents' ownership. Tom had gladly given up those pieces, understanding that some things were more valuable than money. The local community had been transformed as well. The jobs Tom created had attracted young families to the area, reversing decades of population decline. The elementary school that had been scheduled for closure due to low enrollment was now thriving with new students. Local businesses were doing better because the families Tom employed had money to spend. Tom often walked out to the old oak tree where he used to sit and talk to Anna during his darkest days. Now he came here not from despair, but to share good news and ask for guidance on important decisions. He still felt her presence during these quiet moments, still believed she was somehow watching over their family's new life. The financial advisors had helped Tom invest the majority of his wealth in ways that would provide security for Lucy and Ben throughout their lives. College educations were guaranteed, along with the opportunity to pursue whatever careers interested them without worrying about money. But Tom was also teaching them the importance of using their advantages to help others. Mom always said that good things happen to good people. Lucy had told Tom recently while they were working in Anna's memorial garden. I think she was right, but it just took longer than we expected. The memorial garden had been Lucy's idea. It was located at the exact spot where Tom had broken through the concrete floor and discovered the hidden chamber. Anna's favorite flowers grew there now, along with vegetables that the family harvested for their own meals. A small stone marker simply read, "Anna Wilson, beloved wife and mother, her love still guides us." Tom's relationship with his children had deepened in ways that went beyond their improved financial circumstances. The crisis they'd survived together had created a bond that wealth couldn't break. Lucy and Ben knew their father would do anything to protect and provide for them, and Tom knew they would face life's challenges with the same courage they'd shown during their most difficult times. The story of Tom's discovery had been featured in documentaries and history books, but Tom was careful to keep his family's privacy protected. Reporters were welcome to visit the farm and museum, but interviews about his personal life were limited. Tom wanted his children to grow up as normally as possible. Despite their unusual circumstances, regional farming organizations now used Tom's property as an example of how sustainable practices could be both environmentally responsible and profitable. College students studying agriculture visited regularly, and Tom enjoyed sharing what he'd learned about balancing modern technology with traditional farming wisdom. As Tom tucked Ben into bed one evening, his son asked the question that came up periodically, "Dad, do you think Mom knew about the treasure when she was alive?" Tom considered the question carefully, as he always did. "I don't think she knew about the specific treasure, buddy, but I think she knew that our family was meant for something special. She always believed that if we took care of each other and worked hard, good things would happen eventually." Ben nodded solemnly. "So the treasure was like a present from Mom?" "Maybe it was," Tom replied, kissing his son's forehead. "She always did give the best presents." Looking back on the journey from near bankruptcy to generational wealth, Tom understood that the real treasure hadn't been the Nazi artifacts. The real treasure was the second chance he'd been given to build a secure, happy life for his children. The money had made that possible, but the love, resilience, and community that surrounded their family had made it meaningful. The farm that had nearly been lost to foreclosure was now secure for future generations. The children who had faced an uncertain future now had every opportunity Tom could provide. And somewhere, Tom believed, Anna was watching their transformed life with the same gentle smile she'd worn when telling him that everything would work out in the end. She had been right, as usual. It had just taken a little longer than expected,